All right. Let's see here. I just showed this graph for your information. If you write or if you're doing your work within the course on international students, and you might think about potential conceptualization, you could also look at the literature on lifestyle mobility. And there is this paper by Cohen where they make a difference between temporary mobility, lifestyle mobility, and permanent migration. I did not do anything with that yet, but I think it has some very interesting ideas that might be applicable to international student mobility. So I just throw it in here for you to consider, might be relevant when you write your final paper on international student mobility. You might want to use that. But now we move to the reasons why students move, and I would like to ask you if you would set up a research project on the drivers of international student migration, knowing already a little bit based on the previous hour something about international student migration, also having read the two papers. What actors would you focus on when you do it? What would you include? And basically the question is, why do students move or why do they stay, right? So we assume that you will focus on those who stay and those who move. But what if you want to holistically understand the drivers of international student migration, what issue should you focus on, and what should you take into account to get a complete picture?
I think what one of the texts stressed is that social networks are usually not taken into account enough. And I would, I don't know, I'm not a researcher on this, but I would say that social networks are important for as drivers of international student migration. I don't know if is it an actor in the traditional sense?
Or a factor?
It's a factor, not an actor.
I should have added an F there as well. Which factors and actors? No, so social networks indeed is extremely relevant. Any other things that you think would be important?
I think everything what's around financial supports. So everything about money, policy, whatever.
So that and that's only the policy side, scholarships, etc., or
I also think the costs of studying at the country are maybe a big point to have a look on. So if it's very expensive, like it's maybe in the US, or it's very non-expensive or even free, like it's in Austria, this will be a big driver or showstopper.
Yeah, okay, so you point at two different levels, right? You point out higher education systems at the macro level and the way they're financed and organized, and then at the micro level, the financial capabilities of someone. Okay, also very relevant entry points. Anything else, Florian?
Well, as I'm also a psychologist, I would definitely also focus on the individual factors, or if you want to put it a bit more sociologically, you could, for example, look at which kind of values or ideals might drive international student migration. So, for example, what kind of images does somebody have connected to being mobile? Because for some people, it might be very a way to fulfill their inner dreams, to self-actualize themselves. For others, it might more be very instrumental. I just want to go abroad to get a degree from that university because it looks good on a CV. So it could go more in this individual, and also maybe you could generalize a bit on this cultural level of what mobility means for different kinds of people.
Yes, also very relevant points here, and that's some of the recent work I have published over the past 2 years really dive more into this, into into theories like personal development theory that they borrow from psychology, and then also different motivational theories, personality theories that exist in psychology. But that is also all quite new, and so this question also comes from an observation that for a very long time, up until 5, 6, 7 years ago, much of the research on international student migration really focused only on their motivations, and they asked, okay, why do you go? Why don't you go? And then you had these reports, but very little sophisticated analysis that dive deeper, for example, into the images that you talk about, the imaginations that they have, how these imaginations relate then to aspirations, and how these aspirations might lead or not to these decisions. And so, for if we consider different aspects that have been studied, then we could say that that's a very broad brush disciplinary overview that I provide here. But so far, we have quite some evidence from economics, from geography on macro level flows, and then they looked between countries, cost of living, distance, etc. Then we have a lot of studies now on social inequalities, which very much tend to look at socio-economic background, for example, in international student mobility, but then they tend to forget very often different structural barriers that also exist, or more psychological aspects. Then you have these individual motivations by educational studies, geography, and linguistics. Linguistics might be surprising to you, but actually most of the first studies on international student mobility, they were situated in the field of linguistics, and there's still quite a lot of linguists who focus on study abroad. And there is this wonderful study, if you have the chance, or maybe the library has it, to find it, a book by Elisabeth Murphy-Lejeune, who was a linguist at the University of Dublin, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in Ireland. And she wrote this beautiful book in 2002 on international students as the new strangers, based on the work of Georg Simmel, which was a very anthropological study. It still is very relevant and nice to read today, but actually she comes from linguistics, like many people originally. And then you have psychological characteristics, of course, that psychologists focused upon, but they also very often did not think about, how does that then fit with social networks and more structural barriers and constraints again. And so what I then propose in a new chapter that I recently finalized is to bring many of these factors together. Like, if we really want to understand why students move across international borders and the decision-making process to move or to stay, then we have really to focus on the micro, the meso, and the macro level. And we know from different studies that these personal characteristics, that they matter. We know that the cost of moving, mentioned by Barbara, the social networks play a role. But also, remember, in the previous hour, we were talking about higher education institutions who have quite specific strategies to attract students. The prestige of higher education institutions might also matter. And then you also have these structural factors, right? Students generally, just like international migrants, do not tend to go to the destinations that are farthest away, but they are more likely to move to places nearby. You have economic factors, you have policies that play a role, you have the educational system, as Barbara also indicated, you have historical factors that play a role, and that already indicates, and that's what we know from the past 10 years, only how complex basically the whole decision-making process is, and how difficult it also is to holistically research this topic. But so in order to do so, what do we know? When we talk about micro-level processes and potential entry points for studying, and I misspelled Bourdieu, that's very bad. For micro-level process, I think particularly relevant is to, besides psychological approaches maybe, is to consider the different capitals that Bourdieu distinguished between, right? So he made this distinction between economic capital of an individual, social capital, and cultural capital. I guess you were all aware with Bourdieu, or is that not the case? Let's do a quick check. Does everybody know who Bourdieu is? And did you all learn already about the different capitals of Bourdieu? Okay, because that's kind of straightforward, but economic capital clearly plays a role, because what we see is that the most common factor that is mentioned by people when you ask them why they did not move is finances, right? So finances have a very crucial role in allowing or disabling the option for mobility. Social capital is also important, because what we see is that students who have friends in their network, for example, who already went abroad, who have family members that went abroad, they're also much more likely to move. And then cultural capital plays an important role, as international students very often come from higher socioeconomic strata. And there is also a culture there about mobility and the value of mobility that is being passed on intergenerationally. And I will provide an example of some research on that later on. And so kind of mobility very often gets ingrained and in the habitus of individuals, and is used in what Bourdieu calls the search for distinction. And how does that work for international student mobility? Oh, and I just added micro level processes work also through to the meso level, in the sense that that of course you have these micro level processes of searching for distinction that also of course gets tied to changes in the characteristic of higher education institutions, and the rankings of higher education institutions are quite important, these meso level characteristics, for this search for distinction. And so I have two small studies that I would like to highlight, which are very nicely done, in my opinion, that illustrate the Bourdieuian capital and how they impact international student mobility. And the first one is a paper by Nikolai Netz and Claudia Finger. So they had this very nice quantitative data set between 1991 and 2012, where they could investigate over time whether social selectivity of studying abroad was increasing, decreasing, or remaining the same. And so the idea actually always is that that it would become less socially selective, because governments, higher education institutions, the European Commission are a lot talking about providing extra funding or more possibilities to the disadvantaged people. So that should logically lead to a decrease in social inequalities, and they kind of investigate whether that is really the case. But their argument is nice, I would say, because what they say is, well, you have educational expansion, right? So remember that one of the first graphs that I showed was the straight line of people that graduate from university or universities of applied sciences. So we see that more and more people in the population get tertiary education, but that means that it is more difficult for people of the higher socioeconomic strata to distinguish themselves through higher education. Because very simply, if you only had 20 students graduating in sociology in, let's say, 1979, then that was the only pool employers could recruit from. If today that is let's say 350, then your chances in the labor market are actually much lower, and your educational degree gets inflated. That's what they call education inflation, right? Many more people have the same degree, so you're not very easily distinguishable from other persons who have the same degree. And so according to Bourdieu, then of course people would search for distinction in other ways. And that could either be vertically, meaning that you go, for example, to Oxford or Cambridge, or you go to the United States studying at prestigious universities like Yale, or, and that's here the hypothesis, higher socioeconomic strata might also pursue this through mobility by horizontal distinction, meaning that you still have the same degree as other people, but that this mobility capital and this mobility experience signals something also on your CV that makes you distinguishable from other students with the same degree. And so here you see the graph that they made about social economic of high social backgrounds and participation then in study abroad, and you see that it increased by 3 percentage points between 1991 and beginning of the 2000s. And then it kind of remained more or less the same, but we do not see really a decrease in social inequality over time. And here you see another graph, which is interesting because here you see, well, that's important. So here it remains rather stable, one can say. So there is no return to here. But so then the question that they posed was, okay, we see that social inequality remains quite an issue, but do we also see within mobility maybe differences? And then they start to look at, okay, what's the average duration, for example, that people go abroad? And then they, for example, discovered that those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds are much more likely to go for longer periods abroad, which again makes a qualitative distinction compared to those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. It links to Bourdieu in the sense that you need more money also to spend more time abroad. And they also did an investigation of the chances of getting a scholarship, and very interesting also here is that they discovered that those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds had quite more opportunities compared to those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to get a scholarship to study abroad. And so in that sense also, although the idea is that we should provide more scholarships so that those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds could participate more, we still see that more scholarships are actually going to those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, which also has to do with, again, the capitals that they have, the situations that they're in, and if you have to work together with studying, for example, because you're from a lower socioeconomic background and you have to finance everything, then the likelihood of your grades being higher, which gives you more possibilities of acquiring a scholarship, for example, are naturally lower, leading, for example, to this image. But so they discover quite some empirical evidence for this idea that student mobility is a way to horizontally distinguish the higher socioeconomic backgrounds from the lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And then another paper that is interesting is by two other sociologists, Rachel Brooks and Joanna Waters, who did investigate a similar thing. So also they start from the idea of, okay, there is education inflation, degrees are less valuable. So either they can go to Yale or Berkeley, Cambridge, so the high status universities. But that is not always possible for people from the higher socioeconomic classes neither, right? Because there's very strict entrance criteria. And what if you do not enter such institution? And so they did 85 in-depth interviews with young adults from a privileged background who very often had private school education to investigate, like, is their mobility one of the ways to pursue this distinction? And then the extracts clearly show in the paper how students from these higher socioeconomic backgrounds put quite a high importance to the rankings in decision-making processes. So you see three different quotes here from that paper, but they all indicate that they really wanted to go only to the top level institutions, the really vertical distinction, But then, of course, what happens when this gets closed, right? And so then here you have two other quotes that really illustrate that when access to Oxbridge has been closed, that mobility abroad becomes one of the possibilities. And it's not only this Camille or the other respondent that is indicating this. They actually have quite many respondents who indicated that moving abroad is really a way to horizontally distinguish yourself for people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, a second chance at success when vertical distinction within your own country is not really possible. I leave you for a moment to read these quotes. But now comes the interesting part, right? And I should have, let's go back here basically. So you would say, okay, there is this structural factor, the educational system, and the educational system has, or the prestige of higher educations makes it impossible for students from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So you have meso and micro level characteristics to enter. So logically, you would say that they move, but actually, in their research, they also show that only a minority of those rejected there, they actually do really move. And that's where really also when you adopt a disciplinary angle, and like this sociological one, which you then lead to conclude maybe, oh, those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, they will move more often abroad. No, here the results actually in the end, and that's the nice thing, show that all these other factors in the model that I graphed there also play a role. So only a minority of these rejected students, they move because it's these pre-existing international ties, the travel biography, and all kind of other factors that do impact their choice finally to move or not. And that's a nice thing in the sense that it already points to the importance of always trying to move beyond your own discipline and to also look across disciplines for other insights that might help you to situate the final decisions that these students make. So do not stop at Bourdieu, but try to see whether across other disciplines you find other relevant findings that you could integrate. And then regarding meso level, what we know as well, also from the previous slides, you see that prestige and rankings play a role. Students very often want to go there, but also on a meso level, this marketization is very important. That's a term invented by Findlay and colleagues from the University of St. Andrews. So they argue that because of these severe budget cuts, because of this revenue that international students bring, international student mobility has been marketized and is really being sold as a product, and students are actively attracted, and that really this impacts also quite a lot the decision-making process, because many more students are now exposed to the to promotional campaigns. And then there is something that I now borrow from international migration studies. So there's also student migration industry. And you might have heard already about the migration industry, and now we immediately think about cases like the Filipino migration to Hong Kong, for example, or domestic workers, where you have this whole migration industry and agency that train them for their stay abroad. For student migration, that is something that has not yet been flagged up until 2 years ago, when Susan Beach of the University of Ulster did an investigation on the student migration industry, and she revealed how they kind of also have these interesting power relationships with higher education institutions and with students. And then I think, for example, about study portals, which some of you might know, which is a very large organization based in Eindhoven. I think they're the #1 provider of international education today. But so students, they serve to their website, they help them with the decision-making process, but they build a business model on this, because universities, they pay them for every students that they bring in, and students might also pay them for having more access to specific characteristics of universities, etc. So the student migration industry, if you need a topic for your research, is something that as far as I'm aware, only one paper exists about, but which is something that would be extremely interesting to investigate more in depth, how they influence also these decision-making processes of international students. And then finally, we have these macro level processes. What do we know about macro level processes? First of all, we know that historical relations play an important role. So students are much more likely on a macro level to move to countries where they have a historical relationship with, including colonialism. And I just added this very ugly figure a little bit as a joke, because it was one of the first maps that I ever created in my scientific career. And preparing this presentation, I stumbled upon it again, and I thought, oh God, this is so ugly that I need to include it as an illustration. But it illustrates really this proximity, right? That students are much more likely. You see, for example, Norway to Denmark, Denmark to Norway, Norway to Sweden. So there's a lot of regional systems within Europe, Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic to Slovakia, and the other way around, Belgium and the Netherlands, Belgium. So that this plays a very important role in structuring these student migration flows. Then, of course, there's the economic imperative. Students are more likely to move to countries that are richer. But if in case that is not possible, they of course also move to countries that are a little bit less highly ranked in terms of economics, but economic differences play a huge role. Then higher education systems, and particularly higher education capacity, plays a crucial role, in the sense that higher education capacity matters because if you have developing countries and they invest in higher education, but they cannot cater for all potential students in their country, then we see that many more students try to pursue higher education elsewhere and become an international student. And then last but not least, I would say there is also the role of policies. In migration studies, very often you have this metaphor by Weber about policies being a switch of a train. So they might not heavily impact principle or at first sight international migration processes, but they have the potential to derail the processes altogether or to make things happen smoothly. And as discussed in the first hour, what we particularly see is that policies are becoming increasingly restrictive for international students in Western societies, whereas these new emerging hubs, there's quite some policies that make it easier for students to move to these destinations, which leads to quite some shifts on a world scale, and I'm very curious to see what that will lead us to in the future. But so this is just to show that over the past 10 years, we really moved quite beyond these individual motivations, which was the only thing that we had available around 2010, towards a much more complete picture of international student mobility and what drives international mobility. But at the same time, I also think that it makes it much more complex and also much more challenging to research, because of course, to do research where you include all of these different levels, that's an almost impossible task. but there still is quite a lot of things that you of gaps that need to be filled. And so now I would say let's just discuss anything that you think that you take away from this lecture, or that you think that you might want to ask, or that you want me to elaborate on. But I would like to know, like, what do you gain from this lecture? Beyond it is complex sentence.
Well, I don't know, like, if this is like really related to what you were saying, but a bit to the immobility aspect. So I was wondering, like, do you happen to know if like, you know, like ability, like physical ability, like has it been researched, like for example, like mobility or immobility of physically disabled students?
Yeah, there, to my knowledge, there's no studies that really focus only on the disabled. There was this MapEd project, but I don't know what came out of that. But I know that disability is in quantitative studies sometimes a control variable. But I have to honestly say that I never check really whether these control variables, whether they had an influence on the models or not. So that would be something interesting to look at. Because there is a whole, and you're right in that, Hannah, that there is also a lot of policies that are being developed to allow the disabled people to move more and to participate in student mobility. But I don't know whether that's really something that has been researched. No.
I have a question concerning the topic of technically this semester seminar, which is also digitalization of international student migration. And we haven't had the chance yet to really dive deep into that, but how do you feel there will be universities offering online international degrees? Are there already lots of universities doing this? And is there scholarship on this topic at the moment?
There is not a lot available as far as I'm aware, but I do know that there are some studies that are currently being conducted. I know that there is Grace O'Leary, I think, in the United States, who is doing, for example, now a research project on virtual internships in universities. And there are several online programs that already exist. And I know in educational studies, particularly, if you would like to know more about that, I don't think in migration studies there is a lot available. But in educational studies, you should find in journals like higher education, in studies in higher education, you should find quite some material on such online programs. Because there is another. There's a PhD actually that I'm reviewing right now, or that I need to review. I did not start yet, and that also compares. It focuses on social inequalities, and then in participating in physical and virtual mobility. So there is something moving there, but I think that's also one in educational studies. So I think. That would be the field that I would be looking at if you would like to know more about that. And sorry that I did not cover this in this lecture, but yeah, I could only take a couple of key topics here. And it's also not my expertise, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you very much also from my side. Maybe I can use the short silence to also ask a question, which I know that's maybe a bit too specific, or I don't know. So you talked about how from 2016 on, like the restrictions from many national governments were become more strict, and this is, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but also following like what we may term the big summer of migration, which may also like lead to more governments think they are forced to react to that and just make migration in general more restrictive. But I was wondering, are there any numbers? So I think that for many people who need to move, who need to migrate, a student visa is also always like an alternative option if all other options are not available for them. For example, if they can't apply for refugee visa. Is there any data or any maybe estimation about that, if that's a real issue and thus might be a real reason for government to restrict student mobility?
I don't know about any real numbers about the misuse of the visa route, but what I know is that that governments are really targeting these student visas and setting up even false campuses apparently to catch fraudulent students. There is, for example, in the United States, I don't remember in which state, but there was a whole false campus, fake campus set up, and then they also recruited students, indicating like, okay, here you paid some money, and then you get, but that was all fake, and then you can come to the US to kind of showcast visa fraud. But in the end, I think that the final number of students that applied to that was or really paid it was 23. So that's not really very large, I would say, but I don't have any knowledge in other countries or of other initiatives that try to assess this. But it's interesting that, yeah, I think it's a general societal dynamic, right? And that we cannot see student migration separately, also not from these migration policy debates, because they also in Switzerland, for example, Yvonne Riaño talked about how these policies about international students were formed, and there is quite a lot of rhetoric there as well about international students being bogus and just being potential labor migrants who misuse this. So that's a real fear of governments, but whether that really, how many people, I don't know. And it would be interesting to look that up, how many, if there are some studies on the misuse of the visa route. I think it's difficult to set up such kind of research project anyhow, because how do you know afterwards, right?
I mean, who would tell you?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But maybe that could also be part of the migration industry, right? I can imagine that there's also shadow industry there that might offer this indeed as a potential route to get in.
Yeah, what I also thought, and that is maybe a bit related to, or is obviously related to the digitalization, is through this shift to maybe, or hopefully in a way, to more digital offers from universities for international exchange, we also get more like companies being involved in the student mobility regime, so to say, who have their own interests and maybe, and I guess we could see that in the nearer future, that they might like force more or maybe advertise more and give more money to higher education institutions to like develop their own online classes, their own online programs, so they can like sell their programs in a way. So I think that could also be a very interesting development to observe.
Yeah, I think this student migration industry, indeed, with the whole digitalization of society is becoming much more prominent than, because where do students start, right? To search for, look up information. When I went on Erasmus, the internet was still a rather static thing. I mean, I did not have a laptop. I needed to go to and that's only, how long is that ago? 50 years ago or so? No, a little bit more. That's about 70 years ago. And so then if I wanted to communicate with home, I needed to go to a library where they had computers, and then you had to wait until you had a computer, then I could send an email. If not, I had to go to a locutoria like this phone center run by South Asian people, where you would pay 75 cents per minute to call to Belgium. So that would be very expensive. So you would only do that once every day. And when by choosing the study destination, I still needed to go to the library to find a book about the cities. And because also in terms of scientific research, we still had to go to libraries to check, read the catalog of the library at place instead of online. Whereas today, if you want to study abroad, you Google, you get automatically to these companies, and they get quite a lot of power in the whole process, right? Whereas previously it was indeed the agreements that there were between universities, and the name of universities and prestige, and maybe mouth-to-mouth publicity. But now these companies, they have quite some power to also say to universities, well, this is our price, then you get advertised at our site, we direct students towards your institution, it becomes more in the top compared. So that also has it. And so far there is not yet a lot available, but I think that would be a very nice and interesting research project to conduct in the future.
I would really much like to encourage, like we have one research group about higher education institutions, to maybe talk to them how they communicate with external or like companies in the internationalization, but also digitalization strategies. Yes. Are there any more questions to Christof? So you're very free if you have like one or last question to ask now.
I have another question. At the beginning of the talk, you talked about that, like in, I think it was like Denmark and the Netherlands, that international students were kind of seen as a burden. And I wondered, because I think you were talking about like students coming from the EU who have like obviously free education. And I was wondering if there's also instances where this sentiment is on international students who are paying more money, because I kind of guessed that it was about money. But is there also like discussions about universities that take the money from international students, but maybe the infrastructure is overloaded, or there's too many people in class, or I don't know. Is there a discussion on this too?
Yeah, so it's different policy rhetorics. You flag an important point here. So for non-European students, the policy rhetoric and discussions are about misuse of the visa route and then becoming irregular migrants. That's also you see similar things occurring within Europe, right? On discussions on intra-EU mobility and on non-European migrants. So in that sense, there's quite some parallels with general migration policy, whereas the discussion on European students is particularly about the cost of education, right? Because for the non-EU students, they pay quite a lot for their education, so they the Dutch or the Danish or the national taxpayer don't have to invest in their education. That's the idea, because they pay it themselves. Whereas for the European students, they pay the same tuition fees, of course, compared to the national students, and that makes a whole difference. And for example, in some border regions, that really is an issue. in Germany, for example, there is this numerus clausus for psychology programs, and many German students do not enter, and then they say, okay, we can go to the Netherlands. So that way, the Dutch psychology programs get overburdened. A similar issue in Belgium is with medicine students. In the Netherlands, they do not get in, so they get to Belgium. But it can also lead to, fierce policy discussions on whether we should pay for these students. And then particularly, I have to say, if you look at the parliamentary debates, I did so for Belgium, it's particularly the right parties, the parties at the right side that ask these kind of questions. But it can also lead to other dynamics. For example, you have a very interesting flow from Norwegian students to Poland. That is not very well, but it's also more than 1,000 students per year who are going to study a full medicine degree in Poland, which might sound very strange. But what actually happened there as well, it was a capacity problem. So students could not enter the Norwegian medicine education system. But they get this grant from the Lånekasse. They get a step from the state fund. They get money to study, basically, and that's portable across borders. And so then some students, they noticed that in Poland you had these English taught medicine programs. So they went there and they studied there. Then there was this herd effect, one can say. More Polish students went to Poland. And then you had these two governments really talking about it. And so it was a win-win situation, because afterwards the degrees from these universities would be recognized automatically in Norway. So students would not lose time and could enter the Norwegian healthcare system. And at the same time, the Polish government would get quite some revenues from these Polish students, not only in terms of the money that they would pay, because that would be equal to other EU students, but also because they would bring this Lånekasse fund, and they would spend quite a lot more money in the economy compared to a regular EU student who does not have such portable student loan rights. So it can also lead to very different dynamics, and now it's a very established migration stream, which is handled by the two states. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I see that a lot of people are actually need to leave now or have already left, which I guess is fair because it's already
Oh yes.
past 8. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and especially Christof, thank you so much for your lecture. It was very much my pleasure to have you here, and not only to hear from your experience, but also experience you as a lecturer. And I think you did a really nice job in engaging everybody into your lecture, and we had a very, very nice discussion. And thank you so much for your time and for being with us today.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.
Nice. Okay. I guess that's it for today. Yeah, thank you, everybody. We will see next week all the students. Same time, but another place. We will meet in Big Button. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Everyone.
Bye.